Welcome to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the Untold Stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga Community. I'm your host, Guru Nishan, and I was born and raised in this community, and you matter to me and we matter to me. And so I started this podcast for several reasons, and I list the intentions at the beginning of every episode. Number 1, to break the veil of silence that has long permeated and continues to strangle the 3HO Kundalini Yoga Community in the name of neutrality. Number 2, to validate and help clarify the complex feelings of those who joined this lifestyle, were born and raised into it, and or who have practiced or taught Kundalini Yoga. Number 3, to encourage active listening to uncomfortable conversations from our community as a revolutionary act of self and collective healing. Number 4, to let survivors know that we see them, we believe them, we love them, and we will fight for their truth to be addressed. Number 5, to let teachers who are denying, gaslighting, or spiritually bypassing know that what they are doing is willfully ignorant and re-traumatizing victims. Number 6, to illuminate the inherent racism, homophobia, cultural misappropriation, and exploitation that perpetuates the teachings, 3HO lifestyle, and overall community ethos. Number 7, to stop the perpetuation of gaslighting and victim shaming by naming it for what it is. Number 8, to dismantle internalized shame, guilt, toxic positivity, and light-washing mentality. Number 9, to honor all of the parts of ourselves that have been forgotten or silenced. Number 10, to honor each and every body that has come through our community, both named and unnamed. Number 11, to encourage people to do their own research, to process their own emotions, to get somatic therapy and other therapy and support as needed, to draw your own conclusions, and to be critical thinkers rather than to just blindly follow anyone. Please remember that your story matters. Please share it when you're ready. We're here to listen and to support you. Today's episode is number 22, and I want to welcome today's guest, Ardas Khalsa, who lives in the Austin area of Texas. She took her first Kundalini Yoga class in Hamburg, Germany in 1981 when she was 21. She went back to the U.S. and moved into the Roswell ashram just north of Atlanta in 1982. In 1982-83 academic year, she attended the Association Montessori International in Atlanta to be a certified Montessori teacher, and her plan was to teach at one of the Khalsa Montessori schools, either in LA, Phoenix, or at Espanola. She went to that summer solstice in 1983 and instead was arranged to be married to Siri Bahadur Singh in Dallas. The directors of the Dallas ashram sent a telegram to Solstice that year that they were leaving, and it was determined that Siri Bahadur Singh would be the best choice to become the director of that ashram, and she was to marry him. She then took minister vows in 1984. Ardas and Siri Bahadur moved to Austin in 1990. In 1995, she completed a master's degree at the University of Texas, Austin, and has had a career in government service. During the 80s and 90s, she spent most of every summer attending Khalsa Women's Camp. She also took Kundalini Yoga. She also taught Kundalini Yoga until the mid-2000s. I want to welcome you to our episode today, Ardas.
Okay. Hi, good evening, Sean.
Thank you
Can
for
you hear
being
me?
here.
Mm-hmm. So
Thank
you
you
can
for,
hear me okay?
we can, yes.
Okay, great.
I want to thank you for reaching out and just starting with why do you feel it's important to share your story today?
Well, and I wanted to thank you too, good evening, Sean, because I think you have helped to facilitate a lot of healing as this upheaval started unfolding. And I knew, I didn't know this would happen so quickly, but if I get emotional, I'll just need to take a breath. And so I appreciate what you've been doing because I think it's been really, really helpful.
You're welcome. And please take all the time you need. There's no pace we have to keep up with. And it is absolutely my pleasure to create this space. And I'm happy that people are listening. So everyone listening, thank you. And please perhaps think of sharing this podcast with someone that you know that might not know that it exists, because hearing each other's stories does matter, and it supports each other to even remember parts of ourselves that we didn't even know were there.
Yes, feels kind of early to be doing this because, like my introduction, I do consider being in 3HO just until 2020, even though I love a lot of people still that may still continue to consider themselves in the 3HO community. I do not, I cannot really claim that at least at this point, because there's too many disconnects for me to say that I want to be part of the community, the current way that the leadership is occurring. So that's why I said from 1981 to 2020, even though there's many people I love dearly.
So let me pause right there and just say that what you're clarifying is that up until 2020, you really were still very much identifying within 3HO, Sikh Dharma. You were a minister within the organization, and these are all things that you could stand by. And since 2020, you have made a definitive stance that say that is not something that I can subscribe to based on what I've witnessed since the unfolding and the sharing of all the abuse stories and the tapestry that's starting to be. Is that what you're saying?
yes, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. And
I want to thank you because I didn't say that in your introduction, but I know you wrote that this was from 1981 to 2020. And what I heard in your introduction was that most of your life you've dedicated yourself to this path, and that this 2020 revelations really have broke your world wide open.
yeah, it was like the rug was just taken out from under me. And I think there's been many friends that we've taken this journey together in some different formats to do that. So there's been a great deal of, I think, support within my friends that were within 3HO, and I also have gratefully friends not in 3HO, and also a very wonderful professional community that is really key for me, and also my family, my biological family. And I think it's kind of hard to really understand the complexity of all of this for a lot of people, especially if you're not in it. And to me, the way to describe it is I'm trying to untangle a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to do this now, though, because for one thing, especially we're in a pandemic and none of us knows how long we might. I hope I will survive this. And I can't help it, but I have to say, good in the Sham, we were supposed to do this a few weeks ago during the big ice storm in Texas that was just really what a trip that was. And so anyway, thank you for your understanding there and rescheduling. But I wanted to go ahead and do this, and also really because I want to, there's one thing I'm very clear about, and that's the LGBTQ abuse that I knew even in the late 80s that I didn't agree. I'm going to call him Harbudgeon.
Okay.
I did not agree with Harbudgeon, but I did not speak truth to power. And when I started hearing, I did not know about the direct abuse. I heard lectures where Harbhajan disparaged LGBTQ persons, but I didn't connect with the direct abuse that I've heard on your podcasts, on other listening calls, that our young people were just abused significantly in very formative years and in their innocence. And that was just like
midi pity.
Midi pity, whether it was, I don't want to name a lot of names because I'm trying, but I mean, that was just like, I didn't know that, but part of me was like, how could I not have made a connection that if he's saying some things, that he's also actually doing direct abuse, but I didn't make that connection until I heard those direct stories. But even in the late 80s, I would hear things at women's camp and I would be like, what is he talking about? That doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't match my values. And I think that's where I also, though, really feel like that I experienced programming at KWTC. And I'm still very early in figuring that out. And I've been reading a lot of books and I've been trying to, of course, a lot of people for a long time would say that 3HO was a cult, and I would say it wasn't. But I do really honestly feel like now that, yes, I was in a cult, a destructive cult. And I know that that's a loaded word. And this is an early part of this for me, but I think there is documentation in the transcripts of KWTC. I have hard copy transcripts. The transcripts that are online have been, I would consider to be sanitized. They've been, quote, edited for clarity, but I think they've been sanitized. And for anything that could now be considered disparaging to Harbhajan's legacy. And one thing too is that, and I mean, LGBTQ, I don't want to minimize what I now know and have learned and continue to learn about racism, about, of course, the horrific sexual abuse. That I don't want to minimize, but LGBTQ was something I was clear on earlier on. So I think it'll be easier for me to explain some things about that. And I do want to say too that
Can I pause you before you go on? Can I pause you for a second? What I hear you saying is that in regards to LGBTQ, like, you can identify a place in you where you were awake and you were like, and you still didn't act. But you're also acknowledging that in regards to racism and all of the other levels of abuse that was taking place all around you, that you now know was taking place all around, you can't yet identify, that you can't meet it, but you know, you can acknowledge that it was happening and you didn't know it then, at least some part of you didn't. And now you can see that you didn't know, you weren't paying attention.
Right. And or something that I like, it's like the whole concept of Saturn teacher, the whole concept of destiny, and I mean, some of the, like, I would raise my eyebrows about very young women being married to very older men.
Yeah, which happened a lot.
And I would be like, oh, that seems kind of weird. But then, this teacher knows our destinies beyond, you know what I mean? I somehow had something that gave me a way maybe to not pay as much attention as now I wish I would have.
What I also hear you saying is that as you start to look into what quote it may mean to be in a cult, what it may mean, as you start to read these things, you can start to untangle, as you spoke to earlier, things that you might have categorized in a place in you that now can unravel and see it for what it actually is, because you've made this stance that says this is not okay. And the fact that this is being revealed right now means that I wasn't paying attention for decades.
Right.
Thank you. It's a very, very courageous place to stand there and just say, I'm willing to expose myself in this untangling.
Well, I don't know how else we heal without being transparent. And I don't expect people to agree with me. I am one person with my own story. And whether or not somebody agrees with me or not, it's just for my own peace of mind. I mean, I have regrets, but if I can speak on the record, that helps with healing. And I also hope too that, I mean, I have been very respectful of, especially with the second gen, next gen listening calls, they have asked that we not reach out. But as I tell some of my story, because I don't have children in the community, but there are so many children that I love and adore that are like in their 40s and 50s and 30s. And if anybody wants to talk to me that knew me, I would love to talk to any of the second gen, if next gen, but I want to respect that and not reach out to them, because that's what we were asked to do. And I want to say too, even though I don't consider myself in 3HO, I'm connected with the next gen listening calls. And I mean, the ones that are organized by Sahaj and Atma, I think, and maybe Satnam is the third person. So I'm still engaged with that process because I do want to advocate for reparations.
What I hear you saying is that you're still very much a part of the community as the people called us, but you're making a definitive stance that I do not agree with the way the organization that I've identified with and lived my life by is handling what is very obvious a violation of so many levels that is being revealed, and to not address that properly is something that you're taking a stand against.
Correct. I did write a 3-page letter when I did resign as a minister.
When?
I reached out initially at the end of 2020, but then they asked me to do a signed letter. So I actually didn't formally do that until 2021. Okay. And I outlined a lot of different things in that letter for my reasons for doing it. But I had another thought in relation to that I lost the thread of. But yes, I still do identify. Community is very important, and that is something that it is my hope and prayer that, and I do think, like, especially in Austin area, it's very much of a yoga kind of live and let live community. It has been. And so, like, and I'm kind of getting ahead of the story a little bit, but we moved to Austin in 1990 at the same time as Prabhu Prakash and Christ Singh, who live now in Portland, Oregon. And she told me I could use her name. Okay. I'm not going to use a lot of names, but for those that I will, I've gotten their permission to do that. But Prabhu Prakash and I had a motto we went by called inspiration, not obligation. Because we were both ashram directors. They were in San Antonio, we were in Dallas, and we were already done with the whole hierarchy, and even in 1990. So we just decided we're just going to go by what we're inspired to do. So anyway,
that's really beautiful. I do want you to tell us the story to context that, because what I know that to be is that from a local level, you were living an inspired life based on what you, quote, thought were the teachings. And now for all this to come to light makes you realize, wow, there's been a real double life thing going on. What have I actually been into, no matter what inspiration became for you?
Yes, thank you. This is why it was good to do this, because you're so good at contextualizing. But yes, and I did want to say one more thing though, before kind of even giving more context. And that is, I want to put out there that at least one of the secretaries, and maybe two, I can't remember for sure, did tell me that Harbudgeon changed his views on LGBTQ later in life. And this is before I knew of any of the direct abuse. And I wish I would have asked, well, did he ever reach out and apologize? Did he ever say any public statement that he changed his views? Because I don't know of any, but there may be something out there. But if there is anything public that Harbudgeon did actually change his views on LGBTQ, that would be something I would be interested in knowing about.
Fair enough. I think that what I've observed is that if he changed his views, it was because it was in direct relation to how it could benefit him.
And that could, I wouldn't disagree with that.
And other than that, I think that he changed his views on lots of things as long as it benefited him.
And I wouldn't disagree with that either.
So anyway, in that note, it's like the sadistic level of abuse that's been exposed in regards to his nature and what was really taking place, I think is so troublesome that if one looks at it, if one doesn't look at it, then you can tell that they haven't looked at it because it's that sadistic. Like one would have to be like, how could any daughter of our Khalsa have had that happen to them and not pay attention no matter who it was? And you just automatically know, wow, okay, that person just hasn't looked at it.
Right.
And
I hope that I try very hard in this to keep a humility about it, because I have certainly been humbled. So I just hope that there's a recognition that will help to facilitate a lot of healing, because even though Harbudgeon has died, there are a lot of people that were maybe with him that are still here.
That 100%. I also think that there's also that the predatory formula that he propagated continues.
Yes.
In some teachers, but also in and of itself in the teachings if they are not examined for their predatory ways, so to speak.
Agree. And so this is like, so like I said, I've been reading a lot, and I just want to really put a shout out for probably just one book in this and that is, early on I read a book by Michelle Goldberg called A Goddess Pose. Or not A Goddess Pose, The Goddess Pose. Michelle Goldberg is my favorite New York Times columnist. And a friend of mine told me about a book she wrote about Indra Devi a number of years ago, who was a really the first, from what I understand, female yoga teacher pretty much through the whole 20th century. And what that book gave me was the context for why I was so enamored with wanting a spiritual teacher. It doesn't mention Harbudgeon Kundalini Yoga at all, but it gives a good historical context for, like, I will agree with one of your other interviewees in that Autobiography of a Yogi was a gateway drug for me.
That was my Uncle Bonnie.
Yes. And I have to say this, Money and I are the same age.
Ah, wow.
I confirmed that with him. And that was after your podcast. I realized, oh my gosh, I think we're the same age. And we are, even though we had very few years of overlap, because I didn't come on the scene until 1981. So anyway, yes, but that Michelle Goldberg's book was a great help for me to keep me from really just losing it over all this. So I just wanted to put a shout out for her and for writing that book, because it was very helpful.
You're saying that book was helpful for you since finding out all this stuff in 2020. It's helped you kind of stabilize yourself.
How could I get into a cult?
Ah.
How did that happen?
So as your world got cracked, that was the resounding question reverberating through you, was how did I end up in a cult and not know it all these years?
Defend it.
How'd you defend it?
Yes.
So what were some of the things you've come up with?
Well, I mean, okay, there was a lot of I always felt like I was born a little too late because I always felt like I would have been a great child of the 60s. And I
Mm,
was really more of a child of the 70s because I was born in 1959. And but there was still I had an older brother who I adore, but he was, very enamored. And maybe this is actually a good way to kind of kick off even.
please give us the
Yes.
story. Give us the
I've made
info.
notes, so in case I get lost, I can.
You're so good that way, by the way. Like I knew how organized you'd be and being able to share your story today. So yeah, good segue. Way to segue yourself.
Yes, another advantage of having have been in government service. So, well, in high school, I did feel like I was like really a child of the 60s, even though I was really more came of age in the 70s. But in high school, actually, I read autobiography of a yogi, and I my older brother started doing transcendental meditation. So I decided I wanted to do that too. So I started TM when I was like 15 or 16. And I meditated all through high school and college. And actually in undergraduate school, and actually became a vegetarian in undergraduate school. So I was already kind of getting into a sort of Eastern philosophical mode. And of course, the Beatles were doing TM, and I mean, there was just the whole culture around the mysticism of the East. I was very drawn to. So I actually, when I was doing TM one time, I had a disassociative experience where I left my body and I couldn't figure out how to get back in. It probably lasted for maybe 10, maybe even 10 seconds, right? But to me, that was a signal that I needed to find something else, that TM had been useful, but there was something else out there and after autobiography of a yogi, I was like, yeah, spiritual teacher is the way to go. So I was on the lookout for that, and actually went to some different things in college, and hadn't really found anything I resonated with until, like you said in the intro. So I graduated from undergraduate school in 1981. And then I had a double major in political science and German. And I actually went to my junior year in Heidelberg, Germany, which was fantastic. And so I decided I wanted to go back and live in Germany. And so in 1981, I went to Germany, and my father, I was actually in Heidelberg working at a army golf course selling green fees and golf balls.
Classic.
And I had a friend actually from my year in my junior year in Heidelberg that had already gone back to live there too. So we were roommates together, and she was working in the commissary, and I was working at the army golf course outside of Heidelberg. And my father was like not real thrilled that this was my post college work that I was doing. So actually, he met an executive from Stern magazine in Hamburg at some business conference he was at, and so he worked this guy to give me an internship in Hamburg. Mm. So I went to Hamburg, and I was vegetarian in Germany at the time, which wasn't an easy thing to be at the time in Germany. So I found that there was a Golden Temple vegetarian restaurant in Hamburg. Mm. So I went to the Golden Temple restaurant, and I saw the advertisements for Kundalini Yoga. So I thought, okay, I'm going to give that a try. And so I went to my first Kundalini Yoga class, and it was Tutankar.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I tuned in, and I was hooked with the tune in. That was like, I'm there. So I would go to yoga class every night. I would walk from Stern magazine, go to yoga, do yoga twice a day. And then in the meantime, Stern magazine, this was 1981. I was 21 years old. I was like
living the life.
Well, no, in Stern magazine, I was in over my head because it was like this total sexist environment.
Ah, okay, that's
And
interesting.
there's a whole, I mean, I'm not going to get too much into that because it's not as, but I mean, I just was like, what am I doing here? And there were many things. I mean, there were a couple of secretaries I
Well,
worked
you're
with.
talking about advertisement, like if you're thinking about like Mad Men, right? Advertisement in the 80s, right? So totally. The juxtaposition is really interesting.
Yeah. And there were two secretaries that really, in some ways, they were trying to protect me because I was so young and vulnerable and innocent. And at the time in Germany, I think the culture really was that there was a perspective of American women
Okay.
that that we could be easily taken advantage of, so to speak. So they really did a lot to protect me in that environment. But I wasn't really, it just wasn't giving me really any professional grounding at all.
Sure.
So I came back to the U.S. and I had gone to undergraduate school in Rome, Georgia, and Northeast Georgia, and I had an old college roommate that lived in Atlanta. So I came back to Atlanta and I moved in with her. But I was enamored with Kundalini Yoga. And I knew from Germany that to just reach out to the Liftars. And so I did and connected with the Liftars and the Roswell ashram and started going to yoga classes. And they were very welcoming. They were very kind. I would go spend the night and on the weekends and get up and do sadhana. And I thought every ashram had musicians like Liftar. And
Mhm.
I know now they didn't, but
Right.
so yeah, so I was, and
Right
then
into the magic.
I mean, I loved sadhana and I was, anyway, so I did, my friend's situation changed. So I ended up then moving into the ashram in Roswell, and that was 1982. And then that spring was my first tantric. And these were in the days when Harbhajan would come and we would have tantric Friday evening,
Mm,
Saturday, and Sunday.
and those
And
are
he stayed
really
at the ashram. And so we would do all the prep for him to come. So this was my first meeting with him.
the big deal when he comes to the ashram, right? Where they clean out and the whole heads of the ashram move and then whole secretaries all move in. It's the scene. This is
It's
your
the
first
scene.
seeing of the scene.
It was a scene for sure. And so okay, so and this is where I also might get a little bit emotional and may need to take a breath. So okay, so we're at tantric, and this is where you would get in lines and go up and see him in between at breaks, right, when he did tantric in person, Harbhajan. So that's where you could also get your spiritual names. And so that's when I got up in line during one of the breaks during tantric to get my spiritual name. And I also had a question. I had stopped having my period. I had dysmenorrhea.
Mm.
So I got my spiritual name, which I love. I still love the name Ardas. And when he gave me my name, he said, "You will either be the craziest lady on earth or a saint." So now it's like, of course I want to be a saint.
Mm.
So I think that is a hook,
Mm.
right? That's how I look at it now.
Mm. In
Otherwise, I'm going to be
hindsight,
crazy.
right? In hindsight, it's like choose this or that, and if he can read the destiny, then of course I'm going to do everything in my whole being to be a saint. And if he's painted the pathway of what it means to be a saint, then I'll do all of that. Is that what you mean?
Yes. Maybe not quite as dramatic, but
The inner voice is what I meant.
yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I don't know that I put that much thought into it, but it was like, it was a hook,
Yeah.
in my opinion now.
Mm.
And so I asked him about dysmenorrhea, and he said, "We'll have an appointment." First, he said, "Come to a party with us."
Hmm.
But then one of the secretaries said, "No, no, no, she should see you at the ashram."
Mm.
So I thought, I want to go to the party. but it was okay. I had an appointment at the ashram. So then, so I'm there in the evening in the living room, and there's maybe a dozen people there to get appointments. And one by one, he would talk to people, and some people he would be like cursing them, like every curse word in the book. And then other people he would be like, you are the most beautiful, soul, or you know what I mean? I'm not giving the exact words.
I understand.
And as people had these interactions with him, they would be leaving one by one. And so I was the last person there. And there were also a couple of other men in the room besides Harbhajan. Harbhajan gets up and leaves and goes back to his room that was off of the living room. And somebody says to him, are you still going to see Ardas? And he's like, yeah, I'll be back. So he goes back, comes back out with his hair down in his kacheras and an undershirt that's like a muscle shirt.
Whoa.
And even while he's gone, one of the men that's in the room looks at me and says, smile. And I think about that now, Guru Nishan, and it just gives me chills.
Yeah.
Somebody tells me to smile. But it was before he came back with no clothes on. Yeah. I mean, he wasn't naked, but
I understand.
But this is my first meeting with him. And I'm here to find out why I have dysmenorrhea. So then he sits down and there's still two men in the room and me, and that's it from what I remember.
You mentioned how you feel, like you think about that now, knowing what you know, but at the time when he came out in Kachera, you had been told to smile. Like what was going on in you then? Do you recall, or was it just blank a little?
Well, remember too, this is on the heels of tantric, right?
Okay, good point.
So we've been meditating and this tantric, this was my first tantric. One of the exercises was doing 31 minutes of chair pose when you are with your partner.
Ugh.
Like this, and in chair pose for 31 minutes.
Oh my God.
And I did it. My partner sat down.
Wow.
I did it.
Wow.
So I think I was
first tantric, hard tantric. You're on the float. I mean, you had come from Germany, and then you were at the ashram, and then this is your first tantra. So this is your first interaction. Of course, you're just smile. Yeah, you'll smile. He comes out. Oh my gosh. Okay, keep going.
Okay, so he just says to me, he says, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer me very quickly and very accurately.
Whoa.
And he just basically asked me my whole sexual background.
No.
I don't remember any of the exact questions, Guru Nishan.
Whoa.
And so then he said to me, after all of these questions, I don't know how many there were, he says to me, and I'm not going to use the faith that he said, but he basically said, we have to anti-Judeo-Christian you. But he used a specific faith, but I feel weird about saying which faith it is but he said, yeah, we're going to cleanse you of your previous faith that you grew up with.
Interesting.
And so then he says that, and we're going to be done with the interview. He never touches me. He asked me these questions. But looking back, why didn't I say, what is this? None of your business. But no, I'm just sitting there. I think this is normal. This is what happens with a spiritual teacher.
Right. The mysticism of the magic of this moment.
That's right. This is a blessing.
Right.
Seriously. Right. But then he never says anything about the dysmenorrhea. So I said, well, what do I do about that?
Okay.
Now, what that tells me now is that what he was doing was not about the dysmenorrhea.
Mm.
It was how vulnerable am I? Because if you think of a cult leader, they know how to get at your vulnerabilities.
Well, and what we're hearing is that this is part of the formula, that he would do this
Right.
regularly to kind of trace whatever he was tracing to see the level in which he could penetrate or draw him into the fold. But I hear you sharing it in hindsight a little, like repeat, because when all this happened, did it like keep us in the moment there if you can a little more? Like when all this happened, then what? So like did you just leave and then kind of file it away in your file cabinet, or was this quite significant in your draw further in?
So I think in the moment it did not raise any red flags for me in the moment.
Okay. Good.
And when I asked him about the dysmenorrhea, he said, "Oh, see a doctor, they can give you some medicine."
Ah, interesting. So that was just, you didn't connect that, what he was doing to this at all either. But now you're making that link of like, oh my gosh, that was totally a grooming moment.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then I did well, and I have a key point I want to say here too.
Mm,
These are my notes.
I'm glad. Good.
um because and one of the things to me is the whole, and this I'm still at the very beginnings of, is the whole connection with Sikh. And we know now that many of these charismatic leaders use a faith as a cover.
Sure.
So one of the tenets of the Sikh faith is that you respect all religions, right? We don't proselytize. We have a great respect for every faith. We are one of many faiths. But there was a lot of disparaging of other faiths.
Mm.
And that happened in my first, we have to Judeo-Christianize you.
Mm.
Not really, is that really a Sikh thing to do, right?
Yeah, much less a ton of the other judgments and the way that the amount of judgmentalness we did really have that was spawned within the community. As a Sikh minister within 3HO, within, this organization, did that dawn on you? Did that show up for you at all early on in your awareness? Like you never thought about that, you just thought that it's not really doing the same thing as what other religions do to us?
I mean, and this is, and I'm just going to be totally honest here
Mm,
because this is painful too.
yeah.
I think a lot of this was even about privilege and about feeling better than,
You better believe it.
you know,
White
I feel like we were,
privilege, spiritual superiority, white privilege
yes,
all over the place.
yes, yeah.
You know,
And
from
that's
the
been a
white Sikhs
painful,
to the Punjabi Sikhs, from
right.
our knowledge to the rest of humanity. Like there's
And we
layers
know we know
of
the real
back.
way to do a non-cyb and the whole thing, right?
Oh, it's
You
just
know, but I didn't. I mean, the one thing though, this was later on, it made me crazy that we were even like later on that we were not, we could not do rounds around the guru with gay couples.
mm,
The policy was you could marry a gay couple, and this was later, but you couldn't do the rounds around the guru though, because that would be, and I'm not going to get the initials right. You would think by now I would know it because of the Sikh authority in Punjab. Apparently, it would run afoul of that if as Sikh Dharma International ministers we would do the full blown, rounds around the guru for a marriage. But
mm.
I thought that was BS. That we that wasn't okay. That was the one thing before I resigned that I, was like, that's wrong.
You absolutely knew that prior, before all this got exposed, is what you mean.
Yes.
And then all this getting exposed has allowed you to like really pierce more levels of
Right.
things you haven't been willing to see, so to speak, or even feel inside yourself.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's why I love your intention of discovering the parts of ourselves that we haven't been. Yeah. So there's
Yeah,
been a lot of that for
and
me.
I want to just point out that it's going back to what your original point was the extent of brainwashing that was taking place at KWTC, and how the women were trained to go there each and every year, much less all the other levels of very sophisticated levels of brainwashing that are all infused into lots of levels of teachings in terms of subliminals and also
Right.
lifestyle habits and lifestyle practices that was disconnecting us from our own bodies.
Right.
Even though separately these slices or fragments of truth might have validity because they're traced back to real sources, but in this combination and amalgamation, it's actually a design that we're seeing as a predatory practice to disconnect us from ourselves so that we're not critically thinking, so that we're not feeling our own
Right.
emotions, so we're not feeling our needs and wants. So we don't know how to ask for it. And so we learn how to, kind of hide out in silence, thinking it's our own karma and our own soul's problem.
Yeah, we're just kind of, and I was, and I'll get into more of this in a little bit, kind of in survival mode in a lot of ways, especially early on.
Exactly.
And
I want you
yeah.
to just pause there. I want you to let's just moment of silence for us all. Like this, that's what this formula is. It's keeping us in constant, never ending survival mode,
Right.
disguised as peace, as
Right.
light. And the
Right.
disguise is what I think is so important, because psychosomatically, we've been trained to say, oh, this sensation means X, when it's actually the opposite. It's actually a trauma experience that we're calling disembodied enlightenment or something.
Right. Right.
And collectively, we have to own that and start feeling and let the gravity of that kind of dismember us a little bit. Because whether we are actually able to notice it or at what level we can notice it in our own story, this is a part of the collective programming that it means to really look at what it means to be a member of a high demand group, or a
Right.
child, or a product of a high demand group. And there's studies on this. I mean, there's studies on not just what it's like to join one, but also what it's like to be born in one, and the impacts of these generational imprints on our own brain development and our social development. And I want listeners to hear this, because I found it tremendously profound to read about high demand groups, because there
Yes.
quite literally is a formula. It's like a 10-point checklist, and it doesn't matter the ideology, it doesn't matter what is the quote technology that's going to save humanity, it doesn't matter the practices even. The formula is very much the same, and you're referring to it in this episode a lot, Ardas. So I wanted to pause on that, because you're talking about charismatic leaders, or you know this exists all over the planet, and we can all find ourselves in cults and high demand groups at all levels of society, and we have to be able to recognize them as symptoms.
Well, and I've been learning too, and I'm still just scratching the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of things are cult like. And I've also learned a distinction of what's a destructive cult.
Interesting.
Because I think that's why I think this is so tangled.
Yes.
And I'm in my story, there are some very beautiful experiences I have too.
Yes.
So I think it's very easy then to minimize and say, well, there were so many good things. But from what I've scratched the surface so far, what I was in was a destructive cult.
Mm.
Make no mistake about it.
Mm.
And
Thank
and
you.
if not for me, certainly for the things I didn't know were happening. And to me, that even if my experience was all blissful, which it wasn't, and maybe for some people it was, this has got to be brought out into the light, the truth.
That's right.
And it's so many things are just not okay by any stretch, regardless of how much good there might have been.
That's exactly right.
It doesn't balance. It doesn't balance. And it's sickening to me to think, because Good and Ashan, what I felt like was like all those times at women's camp that we would go touch his feet, regardless if I was never touched sexually by him. You use the word ethos. I was part of what was that ethos that laid the culture of those really horrific things to be happening.
That's right.
I was part of the cover, is what I feel like. If that makes any sense.
It makes so much sense, because the way that I've experienced it in my body is it doesn't matter that I wasn't actually touched, but I absorbed it as the energy that my body has held for decades, even when I didn't know it was in there. So not only does that make sense, but it also makes sense on the absorption level of it, that this was the permeating energetic consciousness taking place as much as any mantra that was going on. And you're pointing out just really important aspects to how all of this impacts all of us in the collective fibers of the ethos of our experience.
And I will say this too, with 2020, even when Pamela Dyson's book came out, my first thought was, well, yeah, she was an adult and they were consenting, blah, blah, blah. This is my own, mind. And I'm not going to say her name but there was a young woman who told her story publicly enough pretty early on. And if it weren't for her, I don't know if I would have woken up.
Wow.
And I know you probably know who she is. And
one of the women there was one of the young women of our community that talked about when she had come back from India
she was molested by when she was a teenager. And she was in Guru Ganesha's podcast. The notice of her experience when Guru Ganesha did a very early podcast, her story was in there. I don't want to say her name because she's been under a lot of attack, and I don't want to.
I understand.
I don't want to, but her, I read because she had put it in an email.
Wow.
And as soon as I read what happened to her, and I remember her as a child, it was like the veil had been lifted. It was like the floodgates opened.
Wow.
And we were having these spiritual sister Zoom calls in the Austin community at the time. And one of my friends said the word programming in one of these very intimate, we had like 10 or 12 people. We were just trying to oh my God, what is this? And one of my friends said programming. And it didn't even occur to me until she said it, was like, that's what happened to me. And it didn't, and so, but it didn't take long then where it was like the house of cards just went whoomp.
Whoa.
So, but I just am eternally grateful to this young woman for being so courageous to say what happened to her, because that's what.
Thank you. Thank you for your voice and for reading, being willing to read and listen, because it's so courageous for people to speak out and for us to hold them,
Yeah, but I knew it was true. As soon everything she said, and I knew without a doubt that she was telling the truth. And that was before the Olive Branch report and the whole thing. And not that the Olive Branch report, that's all. Everybody's voice in this is critical. And that was another, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so back, because I know I was determined not to be a super long interview, but
You're funny.
anyway, so I'm going to go back then to 1982.
Absolutely. So you come out of this, right? So you're out of that first tantric, that first meeting with Yogi Bhajan.
I go through my Montessori teacher training
Yep, and because you have
the
this
next year.
plan that you're going to go ahead and be a Montessori teacher and go move to one of these great ashrams that have good schools. Because
Right.
Phoenix was known for their Khalsa school, and LA had it. So
Yeah.
I'm just pointing it out to listeners that if you've heard in a lot of the episodes, there's Golden Temple restaurants in different cities around the world, and near there's Khalsa schools. So like, there's real reasons people are kind of migrating into these communities at these different stages. But go ahead.
Yes. So I well, and even before that Montessori school though, in 1982, so after tantric, I actually went to my first solstice, and then also was a children's camp guide in
Oh.
1982. And I loved my first solstice. I loved my time with 6 weeks with my kids. They were 6. And I see some of them at solstice. And again, any of these kids, if they ever want to talk, I'm here. But then I go in 1982 and 83 academic year and do my Montessori teacher training. And I lived in the ashram, and we were packed in like sardines. And you know what? Somehow we made it work. And I the people that I lived with were so good to me. And even they had small children. They had, I don't know how they did it.
Hmm.
And somehow we made it work. We were so packed in the it was like a duplex that was made into a single family dwelling. And we had like a 6 day, we only cooked one day a week, and then we had all these great meals like 6 days a week, because everybody took their day that they cooked really seriously. We had good waras, and then we would go to the movies and go get ice cream. We would watch football games.
This is all in the Austin ashram.
Yeah, no, this is in the Atlanta
This
ashram.
is in
This was
Atlanta.
like
Sorry. Okay. It's
1982,
Atlanta. Right.
83.
Atlanta.
So, and then this is something else that, like, okay, and this, I'm almost sure that this was during this time. I can't imagine it wouldn't be. But this is as the second next. Do you think, is it preferred second gen or next gen? Do you know?
We're really saying we're staying on the second gen and many generations beyond that. The next gen we're feeling is confusing because there's a whole group of yoga population people that are feeling
Oh,
like they kind of represent like this next generation. But anyway, what I do know is that the organizational reconciliation committee is calling the children of our dharma the next gen, so that's what's adding the
you mean
confusion.
you mean the second gen?
The second, they're
Yeah.
called no, they're calling the kids of our dharma the next gen.
Oh, the kids of the dharma, they are calling the next gen.
Yeah, so that's making it all confusing. But anyways, let's not go there. Stay with your story.
Well, but this is part of, though, because when what during that 1983 to 83, probably in the fall of 1982,
Mm.
two of the children in the Atlanta ashram were going to India for the first time.
Ah,
And though everybody went down, we all went down to the airport to see them off.
right. It was a big thing. It was quite a
It was a big
celebration.
thing. And these, I don't know if they were 7 or 8, and they were bright, shine. I can still see their faces.
Mm.
And we were all there to see them off. They were the healers, the heroes, givers, and saints. And they were like, I just think about this now, right?
Mm.
And they get on the plane, and their moms sit down and just start bawling.
Oh.
They hold it together until their children are on the plane. So these moms loved their children
Mm.
and thought they were doing this great thing for humanity.
Mm.
So I just wanted to point that out, that this was what we were witnessing, right? During those times. And I've been able to, I've had contact with both of these children as adults. For one of them, not for a very long time. And again, I'm just going to be very
I mean,
cognizant
if it
of.
was Livtar's, it's probably Livtar's son, I'm guessing, right? I mean, that's Sapir, and then who else? Some of
But
us know
I
these
really,
folks.
I just, I don't know. I just
It's
feel,
okay. I mean, if there's not a related story, it's irrelevant. But I was
yeah,
just putting
yeah,
things together that I know.
I know. Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to say that. Okay, so yes, then so then I'm thinking I'm going to go to teach in one of the Khalsa schools after I finish my training. So I get so then so I get I travel to LA and to Phoenix to I'm pretty sure I also traveled to Phoenix. I'm not sure that I did. I know I traveled to LA, but I get calls from all three schools saying, "Oh, Harbhajan said you could come teach here." And I'm like, "Well, I can't teach in three places at once." So I call the secretaries and say, "What does he want me to do?" And they say he'll let you know at solstice. So, but I anyway. So yes, but
Huh. Interesting.
yes. So then I am. But one thing I do want to say though, this is something I heard later on, is a lot of times Harbhajan really told people what they wanted to hear. And it wasn't unusual for him to give conflicting information,
Mm,
is from what I understand.
mm. You mean you just heard from other people as they've been piecing things together, so to speak?
And even I heard that even from one of the secretaries that he would be, but it was all under this whole auspices of, the spiritual teacher, the,
I think it just adds to the mysticism, so then you're kind of like, oh, is he really telling me my destiny, or did it, and it's
yeah.
interesting.
Yes. So then I am at Solstice in 1983. And this is when we did 5 days of white tantric yoga.
Mm.
And this was also the days you didn't get tantric burgers. So you're getting up, you're doing sadhana, you're getting your garlic soup for breakfast with your 2 bananas and 2 oranges. And you don't bring in snacks. There wasn't a yogi tea cafe. You couldn't go get you didn't have yogi tea. You didn't go buy snacks in the bazaar.
Waguru chews didn't come till later, huh?
No, I can't remember. I don't think we
I
even
had
had.
Waguru chews. They were around.
I don't know if they were around in 1983, but things over time.
That's
But you
true.
had
But I
five.
get what you mean. Like you're speaking to all of the kind of the comforts that people witness at tantrics these days. In the early days, you're just talking about it was full on
Full
silence,
on.
full on diet.
You were hoarding those oranges and bananas to get you to the day through the day until you got your mung beans and rice after tantric. And those tantrics could last a really long time. And you're doing that for 5 days.
Mm.
So the fifth day of tantric, and this is when there was the cabin that Harbhajan would have appointments. So the last day of tantric, I get a call that I go have my appointment. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to find out where I'm going to go teach Montessori.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sitting on the steps of the cabin, and then Livtar comes up to me and says, there's been a change in plan.
Interesting.
And he said, he didn't say Harbhajan, but he said, he wants you to get married. So I'm like, I am like out of my body, Guru Nishan, right? After 5 days of tantric,
Mm,
after, you know what I mean? It's like,
totally.
but I've already decided, this is how I've already been conditioned. I already decided I wanted an arranged marriage. I did not know, I never asked. I didn't think I was ready for that. I was 23. But even in my mind, I thought when the time came, I trusted Harbhajan more than I did myself.
Mm, mm.
I lost my critical thinking.
Flag in that because I
Yeah.
think this is a recurring theme that
Yes.
we actually didn't have self. What we
Right.
identified as self actually was him in taking place, our place.
He said he didn't initiate students. But on the other hand, so many of us were taking Amrit, giving our heads to the guru. And in some ways, at least for me, I can only speak from my own experience. He was kind of a surrogate for that, right? I'm giving my head over to this greater good.
Well, there was an earlier episode that I think Hanuman had said it, talking about how what people were really chanting to wasn't the guru, it was chanting to him. You know, that he had actually created this like synergistic kind of, and just in the, whatever the psychosomatic disconnect of that is, it's just a really interesting thing when it comes to whatever level of brainwashing that is, you know?
To me, this is the entanglement.
Exactly.
And so I go and meet my potential husband, Siri Bahadur.
Wow.
And he's with Sadhu, who was in Houston at the time. So Saib Singh and Carr, who were in Dallas, I ended up meeting Saib Carr, but I never did meet Saib Singh, I don't think. But they had sent telegrams, or they sent a telegram to Solstice to say they were leaving.
Like leaving the path.
Leaving, yeah, we're out of here.
Right? So they're in crisis control, basically, behind the scenes, but you don't know.
Right.
Okay.
So between, I guess, discussions with Sadhu, I would assume, because this is when there were still regional directors, right? And Sadhu, I don't think was a Mukhya Singh Sahib. I think he was a Singh Sahib, and he left, if not in the 80s, in the early 90s. But he was sort of, I guess, anyway. So he, I guess, was with Siri Bahadur to figure out who then, because it was decided he needed to be married. Siri Bahadur should be married if he was, Siri Bahadur was going to be the ashram director then. And then
going to take on that role, he needed to have a wife, right?
Correct. They preferred them to be married, I guess, is what the story was told to me. I don't know exactly. I don't know exactly how it ended up that I got connected with Siri Bahadur. Maybe Sadhu might have known Livtar. At first, I thought maybe there was a list, but I asked my husband about that, and he wasn't quite sure if there was really a list. Anyway, it's a little bit nebulous as to how they ended up getting us two together. But then we were taken to see Harbhajan, and he said we were a good match. And then he said that they said, so they were asking, well, when should they get married? Should they get married in Houston or Atlanta or Dallas or whatever, something like that. And this was Friday evening. And he said, no, Sunday.
Wow.
So this was like 36 hours later that he said we should get married. So Siri Bahadur and I said, okay.
Wow.
And I still think I was not in my body. I actually don't think I ate, or even though we were just done with tantric, right? And everybody was going to Matilda's and everywhere else. I couldn't eat, I don't think, even until a day or two after I got married. But I wasn't scared at all. But I think I was just not in my body, you know?
Yeah. And I also just want to point out that just like the narrative you've shared really makes so much sense, because it's just like the mysticism of like life and the community, and then also what you shared about like this kind of original thing he said, you'll either be happy or not or whatever, right? That one thing. All of this kind of weaves this tale of even the leaving you not sure what location you're going to go teach, and then so you're already open to anything, like, you know, it's states of openness almost,
right?
States of non-groundedness,
right?
As if this is opening to all of like whatever my destiny is, when reality is it's leaving you exposed to his whim of where he wanted you to go or something.
And this was already way part of the culture, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
this is normal.
I had already heard about so many different arranged marriages, and this was, I mean, I actually felt pretty special.
Yes.
That, oh my gosh, I don't have to wait to get married. I can get married right away.
And I'm
You know what I
pointing that
mean?
out so importantly because you weren't scared because this is normal. In
Right,
fact, not only is it normal, a part of you's looking forward to the day when you get this too.
right,
Yeah.
right. So yes. So
Interesting.
then, and I had already planned to stay for women's camp that summer.
Mm,
My father actually paid for me to go to KWTC
mm.
because I had asked Harbudgeon if I should be a guide at children's camp again or if I should go to women's camp. And he said, if you could go to women's camp, go to women's camp. So my dad paid for me to go. And this isn't, this is interesting because I sort of, my dad wasn't like, one of the things he said to me when I first got into this was like, well, how are you going to get a job if you wear pajamas all day? and, but then over time, I think because I didn't need my father's approval anymore, I sort of put Harbudgeon in his place. My dad and I ended up actually ended up being very at peace with each other by the end of his life and just had this great love for each other. And I don't know, honestly, if that would have happened had I not had this other father figure in Harbudgeon that I could let go of my need for my own father's approval. It's just this like
Like
weird,
you transferred that need, you're saying.
yeah.
Well,
So
because I mean,
without,
that's this longing to belong, right? This
yeah,
longing to fit in,
yeah.
be
So there
accepted.
was no, so I didn't have anything separating my father and me from just having this connection with each other over the years, which was just a very beautiful thing to have. And I'm grateful to have that. So anyway, it was just this, but he paid for me to go to women's camp because I wanted to go. And so I was at women's camp for 6 weeks after I got married.
Mm.
I forgot what my husband looked like by the end of the 6 weeks. We wrote each other every day. So that's how we got to know each other.
Wow.
And so then I went to Dallas after to be with this man, and he and I just started figuring each other out
And to be the directors of the ashram,
and to be the directors of the
which is
ashram.
also significant.
So there are two other men besides my husband that were there at first in the Dallas ashram, this big house in old East Dallas.
Mm.
And it was a money pit. And this is when survival mode really starts.
Mm.
So I have to tell you this story. This is an example because people wonder, like, how could we not have known some other things that were happening?
That's what I was going
And
to ask real quick. Who was the other directors that left that you didn't know?
Saib Singh and Saib
So
Kar.
you never met them. You never heard why they had left. At
I
this
don't know why
time,
they
you didn't
left,
know.
but Saib Kar did reach out to me and just welcomed me. And she helped me to like, I was though shell shocked, right? I am like, I didn't even think of questions to ask her. She was telling me like where to go to the natural food store and just about the neighborhood. She gave me some recipes. This
Mm.
is what I remember. So I don't know why they left. And so this house though, like this house, for example, was this big, huge mansion that had been divided into a lot of different apartments. And then some of those apartments were functional, some weren't. So really, there was only one functional kitchen. But we really couldn't even heat the whole house. We had like French doors. We would have to put our coats on to go from our bedrooms to go to the kitchen. So, and this is a true story. We had a major rat problem.
Oh no.
And we had this thing where, like, there were a few of us, including me, that could sign checks, but we had to have a certain number of people agree for any expenditures. It wasn't just people who signed checks could just buy things without checking with other people. And at one point in the Dallas ashram, there were 7 men and me.
Whoa.
So we had this rat problem. And we had to do something about it. These guys decided up in the attic, they were going to set up buckets of water, set up planks, put peanut butter on the planks, so the rats could walk the planks, eat the peanut butter, and drown in these buckets. This is what we were dealing with. And after this, and the rat problem was so bad, rats were eating rats.
Oh my God.
And I said, forget it. I said, I don't care who approves this. I called an exterminator company and said, what can I do? They said, we have this poison called vengeance. And I said, how soon can you get here? And they came and we put out poison and we got rid of the rats.
So you're saying nobody wanted to use poison because they wanted to...
I think it was more like this fun fantasy, honestly. These guys were like, oh, another true story. I just can't help myself. So we really needed a paint job. And so this is when siding was the big deal. So we would have people that wanted to sell siding that would come by our place and want to sell siding. And one of the men at the time was a wheeler dealer. And so he somehow, in order for us to get a bid, got 2 sets of knives just to get a bid for getting siding that we had no way of buying siding. And these guys literally set up on the shed in the backyard a way for them to throw knives at this shed. So it was just...
I see.
It was just wild and crazy.
This is how the community was growing, eh?
Yes. But I will say this, though. We also had some really fun times. We had this guy, such a cool guy. His first name was Michael. And there was one of the men that had a lot of money that was living with us for a time that set up an attic room that had this really cool, like, wooden floor and set up his own space up there. We used to have sock hops up there with a strobe light, and we'd invite yoga students to come, and this guy Michael would be a DJ, and we would have sock hops up in the attic. So it wasn't all bad.
What I'm hearing too is also kind of like as an ashram location, so people would start practicing, say, Kundalini yoga, and then kind of go to solstice and maybe do a tantric, and then want to come and do sadhana regularly and maybe live in the ashram, and kind of this energy of how the gathering took place, and that each ashram represented, for lack of a better word, they brought their crew to the solstice, and you went there. How many people from our ashram could we get to solstice this year? Like that kind of stuff.
I don't ever remember feeling any pressure around that.
But just in general, I'm more pointing out the community feel, like that this is a part of what solidified this becoming a life and feeling like it's a legitimate community.
Right, absolutely. And we were the only yoga in town. We had like a listing in the Yellow Pages. It wasn't even an ad. And we had a sign out front. Our yoga classes were full all the time. We were like the only yoga in town for a long time. And we had lots of really full classes, and we would have people come spend the night and do sadhana. So, somehow I don't know how we did it, honestly. So, but we had this whole thing going. So there were crazy things that were happening, but there were also really beautiful things happening at the same time.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Thank you for painting the picture.
So in the meantime too, I had 2 work experiences in Dallas, and the first one was very important. I worked for a podiatrist, a foot doctor, and he had 2 offices, and one was in a predominantly gay area of Dallas called Turtle Creek. And so I was working there when AIDS was emerging. Because these gay men would come in and have Kaposi sarcoma on their feet. The lesions. I don't know if you remember Kaposi's.
I didn't know they were named that, but I remember the legions.
Yes. And these men were so beautiful and so kind. And that was when AIDS was it was just beginning. And I remember we had to change our practices for cleaning our instruments and stuff, right? Because of the because of the contagion of HIV.
Mm.
But I mean, I even got poked by needles a couple times, but I was okay before we changed our protocols, because I would help with surgeries. I didn't get poked by needles in surgery. It was more when I was cleaning up, because one of the things I did was do minor assisting in foot surgery.
Now,
But
this isn't a dharmic company. You're just talking about an experience that you had working.
And why the LGBTQ is such a theme for me,
Okay.
because of the horrific
Mm.
things our LGBTQ community has gone through the years, through the 80s,
Mm.
especially into the 90s, that I had very intimate connections with, and still didn't wake up when I was hearing the abusive language at KWTC.
Mm.
This is why this was such a hard thing for me to come to terms with myself with, because I had these very beautiful experiences that didn't match with what I was hearing from my teacher.
Sure.
So anyway, I wanted to say something about that. A shout out to my, you know, beautiful people. So then in 1990, so my husband was also in CBB. And the Bahadur that Saad Hahnemann
Say
mentioned,
CBB. I don't even know what
the
that is.
Community Business Bureau that
Okay.
Saad Hahnemann talked about,
Thank you. So
my husband was also in.
as a
And I'm not,
salesperson, as a salesman,
yes, I'm
got
not going
it.
to get into the details of that, but except to say that Saad Hahnemann mentioned Bahadur in Texas in his interview, and that was my husband.
Got it. Making the connection. So there was an earlier episode with Hanuman Singh, and he was talking about how these companies were set up, like basically so that really good salespeople from all over our community, kind of like were independent contractors, but percentages went directly to the organization or to YB. Anyway, you can listen to an earlier episode, but her husband was linked into that. Thank you for the context.
Yes. So, given that the natural foods industry was based in Texas, in Austin,
Mm,
that's how we moved from Dallas to Austin,
got it.
because they wanted Siri Bahadur to be in the heart of the natural foods industry. So we moved to Austin in 1990. We live in this mold infested 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, but we were like, oh my God, this is awesome. To actually be living by ourselves for the first time in our marriage. Right.
Wow.
But we were hand to mouth for many years. And a lot of because of but this was my husband's choice. He wasn't recruited into this. He was looking for a kind of career path. And so when this was just starting, we were like, okay, maybe this will be a good thing to do.
Sure.
So he didn't have the sales history Saad Hahnemann had already had.
Sure.
So anyway, but
But
yeah,
he was one of the many different sales reps that developed their net with their territories and really
correct.
helped to establish the natural food industry, and how our organizations really dominated those through the efforts of this sales group.
Yes, and Saad Hahnemann's already done, and if my husband decides at some point he can tell his story, but just to kind of provide a connecting thread.
Yeah, I like that.
Right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So then, and we moved at the same time as Prabhat Prakash and Kreising to Austin in 1990. And Prabhat Prakash and I are both planning to get pregnant. So I'm 30 at the time. She's a little older than me, and she said I could use her name. She lives in Portland, Oregon now. She gets pregnant, I don't.
Mm.
And this again, I think, is continued the hormonal imbalance that even started with the dysmenorrhea, right? So anyway, so then I decide, okay, I'm not getting pregnant, so I'm going to go to graduate school. And so this is how then I end up getting into government service. I worked for the state. And I worked in also nonprofits first, and then at the county level. And then I ended up 15 years with the state. And then I still do contract work now. And one of my jobs when I was in graduate school, because I went part-time, was at an organization called the HIV Wellness Center. And this is now when HIV/AIDS is full blown. And I was working at the HIV Wellness Center, and so many people were dying. Yeah. And I got trained in peer counseling through work. It was what then the Center for Battered Women. And I had this beautiful woman that I got trained with there. So when I saw this job advertised for peer counselor trainer, I wanted to do that. So I went and did this job interview, and I worked with these very, very beautiful men that were supporting each other, doing peer supports. And it was while I was there, this would have been in the early 90s, that really the medications finally, like, I remember this one man who really thought he was going to die. And he was so brave. Mm. And then the AZT drugs came just in time. Mm. And he ended up living.
Wow.
But then he did end up dying maybe about 10 years later, because he was already, like, his T cell counts were really low. So he did end up, still dying maybe 10 or 15 years later, but he lived way longer than he thought he would. Mm. And this is still why I'm going to women's camp. And I'm hearing this BS. Mm. And I don't know why I get into Sean. I don't know why. Mm. I didn't speak. I did later on talk to friends about it, but I can't explain it. I wish I could. Mm.
Mm. I hold you there. I want to just speak to the power of our capacity to hold and hide information we're not ready to process. Mm-hmm. And that it's the power we have in our own nervous system to do that out of mere survival.
I think that's a good way to explain it. I really do.
So I want to pause there and just go back to an earlier point you made about how you just were in pure survival mode for so long. And I know you're continually painting the picture for us, and I know you'll carry on. I just want to pause so we can really feel the weight of the story so far, and how do we not see what's right before us? Well, when we're in full survival mode.
Yeah. So we're living our lives. And one other seminal thing happens that I want to, well, not just one, but remember 9/11, 2001. This is at a time too, we were doing Gurdwaras, and we were very closely connected with the Punjabi Sikh community, because we had very few Sikhs in Austin. We weren't just doing our own. It was mostly really a yoga community, and which was fine. I mean, I never saw, I realize now how much it's been intertwined, but I always saw the yoga and the Sikh as having some overlap, but not dependent on each other. Mm. So we were doing Gurdwaras regularly. And on 9/11, right after 9/11, we had some of our Punjabi community that were being harassed. Mm. And we did this really beautiful compat at our house. Mm. And one of the things, because of COVID, I have not been able to do is I haven't been connected with the Punjabi Sikh community for a long time, because I ended up with really, really, really horrible perimenopause, which brought me to my knees. Mm-hmm. And I just basically, again, survival mode, right? I just couldn't do anything except go to work and come home for years. So I just stopped everything then. And so I lost a lot of connections with the Punjabi Sikh community because I wasn't going to Gurdwaras anymore. I wasn't really, and that was really why at the time. But I want to reconnect with them because I'm really curious. I don't know what they're going to be thinking of all this if they know about it. And I want, because I do think appropriation occurred, and just to kind of see, I think
Yeah, I mean, not only has it occurred, it's occurred on a very complex amount of layers and levels,
yes,
and full on exploitation in so many ways.
right.
What I want to ask, if you don't mind, is you had mentioned, I forget what you called it, and I know it wasn't endometriosis, it was what, what was the
Dysmenorrhea.
dysmenorrhea. Did you ever end up getting that checked out and figure out with your health, or did you end up just kind of like going the yogic path and never looked at that?
Well, actually, what ended up happening was I went to a doctor, and he in Atlanta at Harbudgeon's direction, and he was like, the doctor was like, why are you even worried about this? It seems like this is something you should be happy about. And no, there's no medication for you. And I'm like,
Why would you be happy about it?
I mean, I guess this was a male doctor that thought maybe having a period would be like this
Oh,
really great thing for a woman, not to have to experience a
oh,
period every
so
month.
you weren't getting your period.
I wasn't, that's what dysmenorrhea is. It's
Got
when you
it.
stop having a period.
I see. So this is so you weren't getting your period, and then never, and then the doctor's like, "Oh, great," and then never addressed
Well,
it.
I
And it was
followed up. I
okay.
followed up with the secretaries to say, okay, I did what Harbudgeon said. So they actually hooked me up with Dr. Saram,
Okay.
and he actually did end up giving me like this whole regimen of supplements and diet. And then
But was it
I,
because you had mentioned at some point, this is what I'm trying to connect. You had mentioned something about having your hormones out of balance.
so
So
I got my period back, but I do think though that I think that's also though why I couldn't get pregnant.
this is why I'm creating the thread, because
Mhm.
I feel like also what's being illuminated is the dysregulation of diet, the overstimulation, the uncertainty, like a part of all the things that your life is painting out. Also, what we're so hearing from yoga students in their bodies too is the dysregulation that creates in our bodies, which can create hormonal imbalances. Now, you might have had a state of imbalance, and then your life hasn't supported to correct it, even
Yeah,
though we
and
thought
I
we were living.
also,
Yeah,
yes, and I also think that I was trying to kind of go an all natural route of things,
sure.
and maybe, and it's funny when Siri Bahadur and I weren't getting pregnant, we would we would be like, well, are you okay? Are you okay? And we're both like, yeah, we're kind of okay to not have children. So we
Oh.
didn't have that real longing that a lot of people have.
And you didn't go to the doctor to start figuring out what's going
Exactly.
on. You didn't go do testing. And
Exactly.
this is a good point, because within the culture of our community, on some levels, even going that medical route was shunned, it wasn't looked at, and not to say that it wasn't always that way. I'm just, as an ethos or an
Right.
energy, it seems like it's along that route.
Right. I agree. Yeah, I mean, I mean, like the whole thing of being sort of in this hyper vigilant. I
Yes.
mean, I felt so much shame my whole adult life,
Mm.
especially as I started working more. I could not do sadhana and work full time. It was impossible. But I always felt that I was like this piss poor, Sikh student, that I wasn't able to do that.
Mm.
And and again, I'm hesitant to name names because different people have, but there was one person who people come in to do workshops, and different people at different times, some of the teachers that came through and everything ended up being very helpful on some things. And I remember somebody, when I was like feeling like, should I quit my job because I can't work and do sadhana? So I thought maybe I should quit my job. And somebody encouraged me not to do that, which I'm very grateful now, right?
Somebody critically thinking.
Yes. And so anyway, I felt like I was always less than because I couldn't do it all.
Mm.
And
What a theme, again, it's just a
yeah,
resounding, echoing theme of just, you can't do it all. And, my own soul, my own karma. And, it's like this constant keep up. And so fascinating how something can be held in a context of like, that's such a wonderful mantra to live my life by, only to now see it in such a different light, to be like, wow, maybe that's actually a state of hypervigilance.
yeah.
Wow.
And once I ended up having severe fibroids,
Wow.
and it was actually because of a nurse in my gynecologist's office that really worked with me that I didn't end up with a hysterectomy. But I know why women get them. That was always a mystery to me.
Mm.
And now I know why, and it was also because I had a job that had some flexibility and I wasn't on my feet,
Mm. Mm.
that I was able to keep my uterus. But I do understand why women have hysterectomies, because it was many, many years. I popped iron like it was candy for many, many years. But I do think the diet thing is a big deal. And the shame around,
Right.
if you ever, I mean, and there's a reason why there was another name for 3HO, healthy, happy, and hypoglycemic.
Oh,
Did you
wow.
ever hear
I've
that?
never heard that, but
Oh, that was like, oh yeah, that was a common. So then, and
wow.
also because at KWTC, one of the big deals is like when we would get treats and everything. And of course, Harbudgeon loved treats, right? He loved his treats. So anyway,
Child, I never understood. I was like, I remember from a child's point of view, I was like, why is he drinking diet soda from the podium and we're not allowed to have soda ever? Like, that makes no sense. Anyone else noticing? But these things just were so normal. And then the parodies,
exactly.
kids like me would leave and they would even do whole YouTube parodies on things that just didn't make sense. And like the adults just would get offended by these parodies instead of pay attention to the fact that no, they're actually like real, true incongruencies in plain sight, folks.
Yep. So yeah, that was, I mean, and okay, so I have another key point here in my LGBTQ theme. One of my friends, and I can't say her name, she asked me not to, but she said it was okay that as long as I didn't say her name.
Sure.
She was arranged to a man that Harbudgeon knew was gay, and he didn't, but it wasn't disclosed to her.
Oh. Ugh.
And even before the events of this year, he came out. And once that happened, and she told me, and she finally figured out why things in her marriage never seemed to really click. Duh.
Hello.
And it's like, but I think though the whole concept around spiritual teacher and destiny, and I think that there were others that happened with too.
Lots of others. A long history of it.
So I just was like, I just the emotional cruelty and physical health risk of that.
That's right. Psychological, emotional,
Yeah.
sexual, physical.
So the only thing worse than knowing all of this, Ganeshan, is not knowing it now and having a chance.
Yeah.
So that's and then the other thing too, that when the lawsuits, so after Harbudgeon died, and all these lawsuits and everything started happening, I really started disconnecting a lot from the broader community. And just really, and plus, I'm going through this horrible perimenopause, so there's not much I can do anyway physically during that time. Just kind of ended up going local and just not really having a connection as much, except with friends and family, with broader community. But it just, all that happened with those lawsuits just was like, what is going on here? There was so much that just was like, what? And now, of course, so much of it makes more sense now with all of these kids that were the second gen that was encouraged not to get an education, that was all of the this is why I am so grateful that there are only a couple other people I knew in the community that did government jobs, and it is hard work. And are there some slackers? Sure, but I am so grateful that I have that part of my life that is not entangled in this, because I have a part of my life, and because of COVID, I could stop wearing a turban without having to, because I wore a turban to work my whole career.
You wore a turban all the way through until
all the way through
2020. Did you take off your turban?
It wasn't until 2020, but we were already virtual.
Wow.
And so I've told a lot of my close, because I've been working with Texas is such a big state, but I've worked in health and human services. We are a tight community. And I did my last job with the state before I retired from that job was a statewide initiative. So I've got, and so I've told some people, but there's going to be a lot of people because they loved hearing my story. I'm like, well, I got an addendum for you.
Volume 2. So you're saying your identity in your work government life has always been turban wearing Ardas, and this is the first time in your meetings virtually now they're seeing you not.
So I had sort of like an Ardas unplugged look that was with like when we were doing something more casual, I would maybe like wear a scarf with a braid,
sure,
instead of wearing the full-blown turban. But no, this
no flowy hair action.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I mean, goodness, Sean, it's just like, I think to kind of almost come full circle because you brought this out, I think, I mean, I realize that I'm at the beginnings of this. I feel terrible about the rampant abuse that has occurred and want to be a part of the solution to help facilitate healing for all of us. And this, to me, what you're doing is part of that. And I have no interest in being part of an authoritarian model. And we are still in that, yes, to me. And I know that there are people that are trying to do something within those structures. When I resigned as a minister, I was told I could put it on pause if I wanted to. And I'm like, I said, I don't see anything happening that's doing anything differently here. So no, that's not where I'm going to put my energy right now. There's a lot of work in the world to do. And so, yeah, I think that, okay, there's compassionate reconciliation. Where's the word truth in that process?
Thank you very much.
And I will say one other book that was very helpful for me very early on, which is Desmond Tutu's The Book of Forgiving. Because that gives the truth and reconciliation process.
Exactly.
And clear examples of that. And forgiving is not holding accountable, is not holding accountable.
That's right.
right?
There has to be initial acknowledgement before
That's,
one can move into the stage of truth and reconciliation.
that's right.
And as an organizational body, there has not been official acknowledgement of any abuse, sexual, financial, or all the predatory abuse that has taken place.
That's right. So that is and I do offer up. I also, and there's some people I have already connected with to a degree, but there is a treasure trove of information to get at the programming through those KWTC notes because it was systematic.
Mm.
You go back and look at year after year, and I've just scratched the surface because it's painful to go look at. But even because I wanted to be sure of some things before this interview, so I had to force myself to go back to those notes. And it's like, so
I let myself listen to that and do nothing. That's right. It's just atrocious to read in plain sight.
yes,
Mm.
yes. So anyway, so yes, there's documentation there.
I've heard where on some people's posts, I don't know where I read it, but somebody talking about how when they looked at the videos of the transcript, how he was doing signs and symbols and stuff like that, and then he would say certain things, or people that have listened to many of the lectures, how they talked about a certain formula of his languaging in the way he started, what was in the middle, and then what was at the end, and tonality and certain things. And I find that interesting. I've never gone back and looked at notes and these things, but like you said, the programming is in the proof of the pudding, which is the lectures themselves, which is this body of work.
And one more thing, Siri Bahadur, who just passed,
Yeah.
he was atrociously abused every summer.
Oh my God, isn't that true?
And his is not my story to tell. And that's why it's like everybody deserves their story.
That's right.
And it was my observation that he was abused from my perspective. But I don't know what he feels about it. So I want to honor his memory, that his story is his story. But that was my observation.
And the labor of his life being spent recording and documenting everything that is now known as the body of work of our organization in KRI. And let us remember him today in love.
Yes.
And remember his daughters.
Yes.
And all of the effort he did so selflessly.
Thank you for putting that so beautifully, Nishan. Thank you. Because I thought that was just like the timing of that, I thought was, and especially too, since our interview got delayed by a few weeks because of the ice storm, the snowstorm in Texas. So, but maybe it was meant to be that today was the day. I'm thinking it was the wisdom of the universe. So
timing is always in our favor if we allow it.
Yes.
It just doesn't always seem that way along the way. You are so courageous to share in this place, and I want to say thank you for letting us witness you in the great unravel and the great untangle here.
Well, thank you, because thank you for offering a forum of healing.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. And all listeners, it's such a beautiful reminder to just know that what we remember along the way is enough, and trusting that what is supposed to reveal itself will come, but really letting ourselves be seen and heard and witnessed at the stage we're in is so invaluable and can offer a new lens into ourselves and to each other. I know your story did that for a lot of listeners today.
Well, I mean, I appreciate it, and I think our conversations will continue as a community, whether or not they are in these public forums or as our support circles continue. And
when we start to ask the questions and break the silent code and start to speak about the shame that I've held so arduously all by myself, while you may be holding that amount of shame or more. And this is how we start unraveling it, by saying, wow, this isn't mine to hold. It's not yours to hold. This happened around and among all of us.
That's right. That's right.
I want to parallel that the amount of shame I found in my body over the last 2 decades before all this got revealed was astounding to me. I did not comprehend it. And I know that if I wasn't being guided by my own inner soul to start looking at it and approach my body in a different way and start looking at some of the sexual shame I didn't know I was harboring, I would have health problems that I know would have debilitated me along the way. And it's profound to witness this level of opening, because it gives us a chance to say, what has been happening? Like, I didn't know I had PTSD. I wouldn't have called this hypervigilance. I thought this was like enlightened state of Kundalini energy or something.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it is, I'm with you. And a shout out, and I'm not going to say her name right, Zaminia, is that how you say her name?
Oh, Jimena. Yes.
Because after her
Yes.
interview, I read Women Who Run with the Wolves. Highly recommend that one too.
Wilding, rewilding.
Yes. So paying all that forward in these things that are helping us, I think is yours is also a great venue for that. And one more thing, I can't help it. Diana Rose.
Yes.
I found when I was looking at my notes, the shaman conversation that she brought out in her interview. I found it in the notes.
Wow. The one at KWTC.
Yes.
Wow.
So I was like, wow. So shout out to her too, because I think.
Yeah, it's so beautiful how when hearing somebody else's story and then you can verify your own timeline along somebody else's timeline. And I want to say on that note, I feel like my story, even though I was a child, really kind of timelines yours a little. I have a brother who's in Hamburg, or who was in Germany now. So shout out to my brother. I know he's listening, Kieran. And he also practiced there in Hamburg, and many years later. And then also, I think you were a guide at my children's camp, because I must have been there around 83, 84, but I was a young, like 5 or 6 toddler. So
was that the summer of 1982?
It would have been like maybe 83.
So I was in women's camp in 80.
By then. Okay.
Yes.
But anyway, these are just interesting things. What I find so fascinating about these times is like, wow, you really do have connections with children, and children really connect with you, even if it's not in their conscious memory, it's in our body memories of like, wow, there are people we know. And now that can also be bad in the sense that there was violation occurring too. But on the other note of that, there was also genuine love and bonding taking place of genuine hearted people that were there to serve and really live up to their own integrity, like you're speaking to. And our community is made up of that.
And that is exactly why, if any of those kids remember me, I literally have my paper copy of like our women's camp. Like I have the pictures of us, of each of our missals.
Wow.
I still have that. So
I remember the shields we made. And
yes. And kids.
And also, my sister-in-law came out of the Austin ashram.
Who and that is,
it was Cable.
Yes.
And so I knew you must know her. And so just as you were telling your story, I was like, what?
Is Mangala your brother?
No, he's my brother. When our parents married when we were both 3.
So he's your
stepbrother, but we grew up together and he went to India. So we're quite close. Yeah.
And Mangala and Cable lived in Austin the first few years. So I got to know Mangala a bit also. And I'm still in touch with Cable
Yeah.
through Facebook a little bit, the little barely amount that I put on Facebook. So yes, that was so funny too, to have Money talk about Mangala and Cable's wedding. And that was right after 9/11. And I just remember it was so courageous of her just to head on to New Mexico for her wedding.
Yep.
A lot more of us, I think, would have ended up there if it weren't for 9/11. But anyway.
Yeah, and again, I just want to point out, because you brought up Jimena, and then, Cable's an example, but other yoga students that have come into the fold over the decades, there is a mystical kind of like, specialness to the way that these historical stories were told, or the way the ashrams were formed, and
Right.
in the early years, and we all camped out, and there were rats, and I'm pointing that out now because in the marketing machine that I witnessed over the last number of years before all this really blew open here is that yoga students literally would do that. It was like, start wearing white, change their name, want to move into an ashram, go into an experience, have this kind of like la la land energy, which is no different than what you were just painting of your experience through the 80s and 90s. And yet that formula of let's paint the la la land of how special this amazing spiritual teacher was, and how he's now embodied through these amazing teachers that are carrying on the golden. And again, I'm not trying to be cynical, listeners. I'm pointing this out, that this is actually how it's passed on through
Right.
the teacher training network
right
now in present day.
Right.
This is not a mystical, expansive illumination done by me. It's actually what we're bearing witness to, and it's not ending just because we're having these conversations. We have to bring these conversations into more spaces so that it can't just be a machine that swoops people up into the light-washed world of saying everything's so wonderful, when really our community has a lot of wonderful things that we created, and a lot of sadistic, abusive things that what we thought was a spiritual teacher was actually a master manipulator, and has brought forth a lot for us to untangle in our collective lived experience.
I absolutely agree. Thank you. I appreciate how well you do to kind of make those connections and those summaries. So with all the things that you have been connecting over all of these interviews. And my hope is that, especially around KWTC, that may facilitate further conversations there, because there's a lot there.
You are speaking the truth. And I just love how you're really pointing that out, and you're making it a place of your inquiry, and a place that you're diving more into. And hopefully listeners that have their notes can kind of spawn new creative tapestries to let us all see more clearly through this hazy place.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guruna Sean.
It's been so good. It's been so good. I want to just ask, before you introduce your song, is there anything lastly that you just feel on your heart that you want to make sure you share to wrap things up here? Because you really gave us a lens into, wow, up until 2020, the end of it, where you put in your resignation as a Sikh Dharma minister, and you've taken off your turban, you've made a definitive line in the sand that says, I know what I stand for, and now that I know what has taken place all this time, I can't stand in that same place.
Yes, I didn't know better then, but I know better now.
Beautiful.
And I think I'm grateful that I work part-time, so I have a lot of time to study things and learn more and heal, and also be there for other people who are also trying to do that as well. So I'm grateful for all of that, and as we continue this journey. And yes, my song.
Tell us why you chose Bohemian Rhapsody.
So one of the things that we were told, at least I was told when I first got into 3HO, was sort of the dangers of rock music. And I had this awesome record collection that I gave away to a college roommate who was so thrilled to take on my Grateful Dead albums. And I had a great collection. So I kind of missed the Queen era that was going on in the 80s. And I can't remember when Freddie Mercury died. I can't remember what year it was. But I certainly know, but everybody knows the song, I think, Bohemian Rhapsody, that has any connection with popular music. And of course, I saw the beautiful movie about Freddie Mercury, and I felt like it was like my life in relation to LGBTQ lived out through what he contended with. And he said about Bohemian Rhapsody, he was asked, I read, that what does it mean? And he said it can mean whatever anybody wants it to mean. So it reflects to me how all of our stories are part of this story that can maybe turn into a beautiful song. And just shout out to Freddie Mercury with the beautiful example that he gave in his life for talk about what having to deal with tons of challenges. And so that's my reason for my song.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful share. And let us listen. And for copyright purposes, we don't listen to the whole song, but you can listen to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast playlist on Spotify. The link is below. You can also contribute to this podcast by making a one-time or monthly donation at gurunishan.com/uncomfortable conversations. This has been another episode of the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the Untold Stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga Community. Thank you so much for listening. Please do me a favor and share this podcast. We are available on all podcasting platforms. And if you would like to be a guest on the podcast, please send me an email at gn@gurunishan.com. I want to thank our guest today again, Ardas, for being here. And we'll see you again on the next episode.